Okay, so just one more reminder. Next week I'm going to start in on a new book, Capital is Dead. Is This Something Worse by Mackenzie Wark. So check into that if you want to read the book while I'm talking about it. It's a fairly short book. I would guess that I would take 4 or 5 videos to cover this book. So today we're finishing up Walter Brueggemann's The Prophetic Imagination. And there's some reflections at the end of this book on ministry, because remember, Brueggemann, a theologian, a Protestant minister, part of the purpose of his book is to try to inspire Christian ministers to do things a little differently. And one of the things that's long bothered me, and it's reflected in my interest in Brueggemann, is how many resources churches particularly in the United States, just focusing in on the country I come from, they have so many resources. They have so many buildings. They have so much money. I was looking at a story from Christianity Today from a couple of years ago that seemed to be saying that we have over 400,000 churches in America, and that's just an estimate, because there's a lot of churches in the United States that come and go, or they're in people's homes as well. They're not all institutionalized, and it's hard to tell. But let's just say this, that even though religion may be on the decline in the popular culture, in the United States, we still have a lot of churches. And with those churches comes a lot of programming. There's a lot of resources, and it's frustrating how many of them there are, and yet how little they are a strong presence within their communities for creating change in how we view community and how we do community. Now, before people kind of get their backs up because churches do donate a lot of money and have a lot of programming that helps poor people and so on, I just want to give me a chance to explain. So churches often are organizations that reflect the dominant culture. Coming at this using Brueggemann's language, they reflect the dominant culture because they have adopted the model of the business world, of the commercial economy, in the way that they interact with the people in the pews, the people who are members, and the outside community. So a lot of times they'll operate kind of like they have the feel of a business or corporation or a nonprofit organization for charitable purposes. And sometimes that's great. They can still do a lot of good. But what we don't tend to absorb is that they often have fully embodied the model of the world as it currently exists. So a lot of their concerns tend to revolve around commercial concerns, or what are kind of like commercial concerns in this religious sphere. So things like, their brand, how they will present themselves, the imagery and the promotional material that they will use, the numbers that they have, and the imperative that those numbers have to grow. Concentration on how much money they bring in, and getting their members to pledge a certain amount of money, and that money often goes for recruiting more members, and a lot of that is tied up with making more space. And so all these churches, these whatever it is, 400,000 churches, a lot of them are attempting to become even bigger in a physical sense of, adding on an addition or a gym or a an entertainment section, stadium, whatever it may be. So growth, like the idea of growth, or grow or die, is very much a part of a lot of churches' mentality. Churches are often justifiers of the status quo, as that they're maybe a little bit too likely to just kind of accept things the way they are, or even back the way things are. And promote models of condemnation and charity. What I mean by that is that a lot of times, if churches are socially aware, it can be in the sort of negative sense of, well, there's a problem over there with those people, whether it's women having abortions or it's, illegal immigration or whatever it may be. There's a problem over there with those people. And so there's a lack of focus on, is there a problem with us? What are our problems? And maybe even more importantly, what are we doing with ourselves to create ourselves into something better that can maybe help solve some problems? So there's this negativity and this condemnatory tone. And then there's the charitable angle, where churches believe that they are doing what they're supposed to do if they create a program to help the poor. So, and this is, a lot of this stuff is great, does a lot of good. I'm not saying stop this, but what they will do is they will create a program or participate in a program that invites the poor to something like a weekly meal, or a program that gets church members with members in the community who are disadvantaged to kind of mentor them and so on. So within that charitable model is this us versus them assumption, right? There's us and then there's these other people, and our Christian duty is to reach out to them and to more or less help them become like us, but not necessarily become a part of our community, right? So in fact, the assumption is often that they are so other that we're not thinking about them becoming a part of our community. So in a way, the charitable mentality can be a part of the problem. I know that sounds weird, but I think that's true. And oftentimes churches become stand-ins for political parties and interest groups because of that negative or condemnatory focus. They're pretty susceptible to identifying with one particular political agenda or another. And as we've seen from the other videos on Brueggemann would say that this is a submission to the system of the world, right? The royal consciousness, as he puts it, which places all of the burden and responsibility on the government to fix all of the problems. It passes it off to somebody else. Just as if we write a check to a charitable organization, it passes off the responsibility to them. We pay taxes, we participate in political activity, and so we pass it off to the government. So then the question is, what then could churches be? And this Brueggemann has given us a model, or at least the beginning of a model of what churches could be. And so I want to talk about three functions of churches inspired by what Brueggemann had to say in this book. The first function we know very well is effective mourning, okay? I have Paula White there on one side and Jeremiah on the other. Paula White in her bodycon dress, which is pretty much a constant feature of her wardrobe, and her 6-inch stiletto heels, basically out there on the stage telling us that America is great, we kick butt, and basically churches just need to get behind the political party of her choice. And then we have the model of Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, whom Brueggemann admires and whom he thinks that pastors ought to emulate, who was very upset. These are not their words, but my words for them. But I think that the message Paula is saying there is pretty close to what she actually says lots of times. And with Jeremiah, it's, listen, people, we're not living right. Wake up, okay? And he could see the handwriting on the wall. He could see that the people of Israel were going to suffer, and they were going to go through a lot of hell. And he was in constant mourning for that. And his warnings and his mourning set people up, Brueggemann says, to realize their situation when the time really came, when they hit the wall. To be able to mourn and to grieve, and he was the first to grieve. So religious leaders could consistently acknowledge that things are not as they should be and allow people to have that truth sink in and grieve. Hi, this is the famous kitty. She has a tendency to like to get up on the table. All right. So the second function is imagining better futures. Okay, now in this role, the church and the pastor go towards breaking free of the royal consciousness and just having the creative imagination to think of how people could live, act, and believe differently. Brueggemann has said that imagination is absolutely crucial to moving forward, and that churches could be that place of imagining an alternative community. And by that, he very much means imagining themselves as an alternative community, using the cultural treasure of the biblical narrative to inspire them. So we've already talked about that, but just suffice it to say that Brueggemann thinks that we have this grand narrative, this story in the biblical heritage, which could provide plenty of fodder for people to reimagine their ways of life and what the church could do. The third function starts out with reenchantment. That's a term from Charles Taylor, or at least disenchantment is, but reenchantment would be things such as imagining and then accepting that, for the Christian or the person, anybody who believes in God, that God rules in the world now and not people, that the world is kind of on loan from God, to use a famous phrase. And also that another example of reenchantment would be to return to the belief that God is most present in the poor. Mother Teresa believed this because this has long been a Catholic and Christian heritage, a way of thinking about the poor and the downtrodden that elevates them instead of loading them down with blame and criticism. In this way of thinking, the poor are actually an opportunity for you to not just do things for God, but to engage with God and to befriend God, or Jesus in the case of Christianity, and to really be with Jesus in his presence. That's a very different view of the poor. Among the things that it does for us is it makes us realize that maybe our job is not to fix poverty so much as to be friends, to be true friends and neighbors. I think Jesus said the poor will always be with us. In practice, this might mean the churches open their doors to the poor and the homeless, and not just for programming and then send them back out on the streets, but like the church in the first video on Brueggeman that I did, figure out a way to let some of them live there, or live there as long as they need to live there. I know this sounds extremely radical, but think of the monstrosity of having all of these huge, heated, well-furnished buildings all over the United States that represent Christianity, closed except for when Christians have meetings, while people are living on the streets, while there are poor people living in very substandard housings, while there are people isolated in their homes. That, when you think about it, is just a monstrosity. It's a complete misuse of resources. Furthermore, in practicing the kingdom of God, going beyond imagination to practicing, churches could partially exit the consumer economy through cooperating within the church, cooperating in the forms of exchanging expertise, works, items, growing some of their own food. In other words, creating sort of a halfway between the liberal way of life and the communal way of life, that's actually quite comfortable, or could be, because it's represented within an institution where people can come and go. But where people can cooperate in safety, or at least in more safety, to do these types of things with each other and for each other, and maybe even have the financial power to hire some of it done. For instance, could they employ a few people in their community to use some of the land, which is sometimes pretty vast, around their church buildings, to grow food for themselves and for other people in their community, so that people didn't have to become broke trying to eat healthy food. They could practice the kingdom of God by ceasing their criticism and their anti-consciousness, their tendency to think negatively, and embody the highest values in action towards each other. Okay? Churches generally look outward to domestic and international mission and charity work. But an alternative model would be charity starting at home. And while that might sound selfish, it's not selfish if church communities did it well enough, because then they would have the capacity for others to join them and for others to be taken care of within their communities. And churches could begin to provide aid in the form of friendship, in the form of non-judgmental friendship and cooperation with members of their community for real. I am totally, if you're a hippie, excuse me, I'm totally fine and tolerant of hippies. But on the other hand, when we think of groups cooperating in mutual aid and in providing things for each other, people's minds tend to go towards the sort of hippie commune thing. And what I'm trying to say is that's an old model. It certainly isn't what has to happen. None of this implies that everybody's going to turn into hippies. Churches being involved in doing this might actually be that sort of halfway house, so to speak, between the liberal commercial economy and hippie commune. So another option for churches would be to become alternative communities, that function well enough to entice others to join, because there are real benefits. They could solve problems just by taking steps away from full immersion in the consumer economy and the managerial mindset, but still live in houses, have jobs, and not worry so much about tithing. Many people hear about tithing, few people do it. I don't do it. Tithing oftentimes is the support of the institutional church as it is. It's the paying for all that building, all that heat, all that air conditioning, all that programming, all that capital campaigning, all that stuff. That's not necessarily good use of the money. What if the money was used to create more useful things for people, not just gyms where people can have wedding ceremonies and play basketball, but where people could truly help each other and themselves in a variety of ways? Well, tithing would then become kind of natural, because you'd probably spend about 10% of your time, and maybe less than that in money, probably a lot less in money, and get a much bigger result. Now, if this sounds really far-flung and imaginative, it is. We do too much criticizing and negative thinking. We do too much of saying, oh, that could never happen. But we know from history that things can change really drastically and sometimes really quickly. No system ever remains the same. And so this is just one way of imagining an alternative future. Anyway, I think that's what Walter Brueggemann wants us to try to do.